Okay, well, I think I can at least begin with the introductions. Well, hi everyone. This is Ikray Mom, and I'm the coordinator for the Harvard and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center for the New England Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. I just want to review a few housekeeping items before we begin. So participant microphones will be muted at entry. If you have any questions during this event, please use the chat. This session is being recorded and it will be emailed to all participants once available. If you have any questions after this session, please email newengland@mhtdcnetwork.org. At the end of the month, we will send you a certificate of completion that you can submit to your particular board for continuing education credit. Please contact iFisher at C4Innovates for more information on CEs after the event. This is just a description for disclaimers for MHTTC. The MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. That language is strengths-based and hopeful, inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences, healing-centered and trauma-responsive, inviting to individuals participating in their own journeys, person first and free of labels, not judgmental and avoiding assumptions, respectful, clear, and understandable, and consistent with our actions, policies, and products. And with that, it is my pleasure to hand it out over to Kelsey for introductions.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so today we have Dr. Ryan Madigan with us discussing C-PTSD, which we'll hear more about. But so I'll give a quick introduction. Dr. Ryan Madigan is a licensed clinical psychologist and the founder and director of the Boston Child Study Center. So he's held teaching positions really across Massachusetts at Wellesley College, Rutgers University, Boston University, McLean Hospital, and Harvard Medical School. And as an attending clinician at McLean Hospital, he co-founded the DBT Trauma and Exposure Program, which specializes in suicide, non-suicidal self-injury, trauma, personality disorders, and psychosis. So his research focuses on the development of a single transdiagnostic intervention for trauma and emotion disorders. Today, we'll really be focusing on that trauma piece. So thanks all for starting to introduce yourselves in the chat. Please do, but I will hand it over to Dr. Madigan.
Thanks, Kelsey. And thanks everybody for tuning in today. Let me just share my slides with y'all. Okay, they're showing up okay? Great. So excited to talk to a group of experts on psychosis and thought disorders. I don't know that I've ever presented this to a group like this. So before I jump in, I'd love people's thoughts as we go, and maybe if there's time at the end on beyond just the application to CPTSD, if or how you might find some of this applicable to your current work as well. I found it immensely interesting over my career, where I started very specific ABA with kids on the autism spectrum. I grew to PCIT and then ACT and DBT and other things over the years. And I'm sort of thinking of myself as an interventionist more than somebody who's sought to work with a particular population. And the more interventions, the more theory and conceptualizations I've sort of learned and had exposure to, the more I find most things have more in common that we work with than they are different. And I used to put thought disorders in its own little sort of biological category. And then I attended a training. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Beck Institute has a cognitive therapy for psychosis, which to me looked like they were providing a ton of validation. They wouldn't call it that because it's, I think a territorial thing, but it felt like they were really trying to validate these individuals. And I was astonished to watch in these videos how a person's thinking would go from really, sort of thoughts out all over the place to quite linear over a pretty short period of time. So that got me thinking, oh my God, maybe even, psychosis and thought disorders has as more of a transdiagnostic piece than I thought, or I was originally trained. But you guys are the experts, so we'll save that for the end. But just to sort of put a pin in that idea, I'd love to come back to it and see what people's thoughts are. So broadly speaking, our goal, our scope today, my agenda is to change your view of trauma. In doing so, change your view of emotions, and see if we can't better understand complex PTSD in maybe a slightly different way. So we're going to talk about classic PTSD as well as complex trauma and other forms. A huge gap. It's incredibly ironic to me how invalidating the field of trauma is to people who've been traumatized. Right, that criterion A event I just irks me all day long. But we'll get into that in terms of a big gap that the field of trauma has yet to address. We're going to talk about some theoretical mechanisms of trauma that will hopefully make not only classic PTSD, but also complex trauma sort of a bit more understandable, approachable. And then orient to the intervention I prefer to sort of think of and go to when thinking about how to treat complex trauma. And then a new intervention I'm developing that extends some of these principles to hopefully allow us to treat all emotion disorders with a transdiagnostic sort of method. So just to go back to our Psych 101 textbooks for a moment, categorically speaking, classic PTSD, as it's defined in the DSM-5, has that arduous, annoying to me criterion A event where threatened, death or injury, real or threatened death or injury, more or less is the sort of gatekeeper to the rest of the diagnosis, followed by re-experiencing, flashbacks and nightmares, avoidance of trauma reminders, and a persistent sense of sort of threat, danger, hypervigilance. It's obviously a little more nuanced than that. There's more symptoms, but that's a sort of the categorical classic PTSD that Edna Foa and others, PE, CPT, to name a few evidence-based treatments, have shown to be quite effective at treating. Complex PTSD, not yet in the DSM-5, but it is defined in the ICD as basically being classic PTSD with that criterion A event, plus these three additional experiences, which, if you really think about it, have an incredibly pervasive sort of reach into a person's life. So affect dysregulation, whether that's be like quick to become quite dysregulated, or a difficulty experiencing affect or emotion, numbing, dissociation, negative self-view, and disturbances in relationships, so sort of difficulty with one's view of others. So already, I hope you're seeing that this isn't just like a ADHD inattentive versus hyperactive. This is a much more pervasive sort of impacting condition, and classic PTSD was already pretty pervasively impacting. But we're gonna try to sort of understand how something similar can go to affect so many deep pockets of a person's lived experience. What's happening here? Like how do we understand the development of these symptoms? There is some literature out there that is really starting to describe that maybe one of the things that differentiates CPTSD is the chronicity of the traumatic exposure, the interpersonal nature of it. I've got my own theory, which you'll hear about in a little bit. But there isn't a consensus about what makes what about the event or the experience gives rise to a different outcome. Say, for example, classic PTSD versus complex trauma. Any cooks or chefs out there? I am definitely not one of them. My wife's a great cook. My partner, Nathan, in Boston Child Study Center, Boston, is a fantastic chef. spoiled me all through grad school. We were roommates with incredible food. I was not starving with ramen, thanks to him. But in that, I learned what a reduction was. And this concept in food, I think, really kind of fascinatingly applies to transdiagnostic conceptualization. And I'm always sort of seeking, maybe it's my own ADHD and executive function deficits, but I'm always seeking to like simplify my understanding of something that's otherwise incredibly complicated and difficult to make sense of. So if we think of trauma through the lens of a reduction, I like to think of classic PTSD as a phobia of a memory. Now, this could be extremely invalidating to a person with classic PTSD who survived a physical assault or something like that. I don't mean it. I don't say that to mean it's that simple or only that impacting, but that at the end of the day, all these symptoms and parts of what constitutes classic PTSD come from this core mechanism, if you will, this issue around re-experiencing the memory, wanting to avoid reminders of the memory, hypervigilance around something like the memory occurring or reoccurring. So in reductionistic terms, I'm not sure that's a word. Classic PTSD, in my mind, is a phobia of a memory, as compared to complex trauma, which is more of a phobia of an emotional experience or experiences that one's mind associates with past traumatic experiences. Now, if you have classic PTSD, you certainly can have phobias of the emotional experiences that co-occurred as well. But at its core, where the symptoms and therefore the treatments are all pointing to is this phobia of memory. So not surprisingly, the CPT folks, cognitive processing therapy, or the PE folks, prolonged exposure, we are going after that memory with prolonged exposure. We are trying to treat that phobia of that memory, and it works quite well. In C-PTSD, we have a memory or memories, but we also have this sort of messier, broader impact on a person's life where they're experiencing symptoms of C-PTSD, but not necessarily in as direct a line as you see with classic trauma, classic PTSD. And I'm also going to argue that we could take this line of thinking and extend it even beyond C-PTSD to all emotion disorders, but that's not the scope of today's talk. So this thing is what I sometimes call a trauma map, which hopefully will distinguish from a trauma network, which we'll get into in a little bit. But when I'm thinking of classic PTSD as a phobia of a memory, and trying to make sense of how the corresponding symptoms then come from it, we start obviously with this traumatic experience. Something awful happens, right? Here's the criterion A event. And not everybody who experiences a criterion A event goes on to develop PTSD. But those who do, there is something so disturbing in nature to this experience that we struggle to remember it, to look back and recall, re-experience what occurred. And we develop effectively, like I said before, a phobia of the memory. Our brain is now on a mission to get away from, prevent, escape from that memory. Because our memories work through associations, right? If I say ocean, what word comes to somebody's mind? Feel free to say it out loud or in the chat. What's the first word that comes to people's minds? Sand. Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. So I didn't make you think or say sand or fish, right? But your mind associated ocean with, thanks, Jake and Peggy, sea, clear weather, right? Those concepts came into your minds because of the association between the concept of trauma, the concept of ocean, and its associations. So similarly, if my mission now as a survivor of trauma with PTSD is to avoid the memory of the event, I've got to avoid direct reminders. Like, so, Michelle starts talking about that event that happened to me that day, and I get out of there. I walk out of the room, or I dissociate, or I go use substances to chemically escape. I got to get away from those direct reminders. Add to that indirect reminders, things that, you know, a smell that occurred that day, a sound, etc. You can start to see the symptoms of classic PTSD. You can start to see, hopefully, through this diagram, how they derive from that original phobia of the memory, because of the way our memories work through associations. We're going to come back to this, but why, the question to leave here, why, what is it about the memory that is so disturbing that, I mean, clearly nobody would want to willingly go back over a traumatic memory, but the inability to tolerate what comes with it, why is that? What is causing that, which we will hopefully be able to explain through this other concept that we'll get into in a bit, called the trauma network. So Martin Bohas, I don't know if you guys are familiar, but beyond the classic PTSD evidence-based treatments like NFOA and others have created, my world, I'm a DBT therapist sort of at my core. My world starts in working with folks who are suicidal or self-harming and also have some sort of trauma. So DBT-PE is my go-to intervention if I've got somebody with classic PTSD and those co-occurring suicidal, self-harming, pretty severe emotion dysregulation symptoms. But if the individual's experience goes beyond that of classic PTSD, there's a sort of cousin treatment called DBT-PTSD, which is less well known in the US because it was developed by a psychiatrist, Martin Bohas, in Germany, which was really built to tackle both that phobia of the memory, because again, there's still that unfortunate criterion A event to deal with, but also it's built to take on these other three sort of more pervasive symptom areas that I would argue a classic PTSD treatment doesn't quite, certainly has an impact on the phobia of the memory, but doesn't quite get to the rest. And in the treatment that he developed, he's sort of coined this trauma network term, which as it was introduced to me by Martin, really had a focus on childhood sexual abuse and the physiological experiences that one might encounter during such a horrific event or events. And it's a model that he uses to present trauma to a client so that they can understand trauma. I found this particular version of it maybe overwhelming or perhaps again, maybe my obsession with reductions a little more complicated than it had to be. So I started sort of trying to make it a little more to the point and simple, and quickly found that it applies really well to all emotions. So it not only helps me understand when we apply Martin's model to all emotions, which we're going to do together momentarily, it not only helps us understand C-PTSD, it helped me understand classic PTSD, and then I started realizing it's helping me understand all emotion disorders, because like I alluded to before, I really am starting to see the wisdom in most of these conditions have more in common than they don't. So I can't help y'all understand this expanded concept of a trauma network without introducing this mechanism within it called traumatic conditioning, which is what our research and focus has been on most recently. And in order to do that, I kind of have to bring y'all into some of the DBT 101 fundamental assumptions and principles first, so as to not add to the confusion and make assumptions that we're on the same page when perhaps we're not. So for those of you who are familiar with DBT, forgive the next 20 or so minutes. It's going to be it'll be a review. For those of you less familiar with DBT, I hope you find this sort of discussion interesting, at least. So there's three assumptions we have to make or take into this idea of understanding traumatic conditioning, which is the sort of mechanism that gives rise to a trauma network or the diagnosis of C-PTSD. So the first is emotions are not symptoms. right? This is a really simple, almost like ignorable sentence, but all of my cognitive behavioral therapy training did not make this assumption, right? I was trained to seek out irrational thinking, to seek out and eliminate irrational emotions, because that's why people were coming to treatment for anxiety disorders and mood disorders and depressive disorders. We are in the business of eliminating those emotional disorders, which sets us up to think of emotions in general as symptoms when they are not. There's no biological research or data that suggests these emotions should be viewed as symptoms. They should be viewed as signals. Yes, of course, you look at the DSM, but I would argue the DSM is starting off in a very flawed assumption that emotions are symptoms, and therefore we have greater levels of mental illness than ever before in our culture, and we simultaneously have access to more evidence-based treatments than ever before. That doesn't make sense. I would argue we're missing something with the treatments that we are offering in a way that is not actually getting at it. But that's a debate for another day. So assumption number one: emotions are not symptoms; they're signals. And we're going to go into a little bit more depth about what that means. So this is a situation that I'm pretty sure everybody can agree on how we're going to handle. Right? We got on an airplane. We peek into the cockpit. We see the pilots are in there, and there are alarm bells and lights blaring. Right? There's massive problems with this aircraft, and we see the captains covering up those alarms with duct tape and marker to make them go away. What do we do? I'm getting off that plane. Right? I hope everybody gets off that plane, because those are the kinds of signals I would definitely not want my captain or captains ignoring. So here we've got this like really almost like boringly comical, like a rhetorical question, like, what do? You get off the plane, obviously. So if it's so obvious here, why then do all of us, including us professionals, we as professionals, why are we all ignoring the very neurological symptoms in our cockpit, in our dashboard, in our brain that are meant to give us information about our needs? All right, I know this sounds almost silly. This is not the same thing as an anxiety specialist telling a patient that anxiety is normal and sometimes healthy, and then jumping right into cognitive restructuring, which I would argue is invalidating to the functional parts of anxiety sometimes. But this is beyond that. This is our mission as mental health providers, is to help clients, especially clients with trauma, get back in touch with their emotions that come from their brain as signals. When I do that, I usually start with signals that we as a culture more or less accept, right? We accept we get off this plane because those signals are valid. We accept that when we're hungry, it means we're low in energy or calories and we need to eat to replenish those. And we accept that when we eat, the hunger goes away because the signal did its job. We accept that if you're in these two, hot situations, we know what the pain is trying to tell us. It's trying to protect us. It's not a symptom. It's not a disorder. It's a signal, right? So we have no problem listening to our brains in these three scenarios. But somewhere in history, somebody drew a line that said these are valid biological signals and these are not. These are in your head. These are symptoms. These are signs of mental health disorders and illness or weakness. What data do we have on the brain that suggests that there is a line in our brain with irrational emotions that need to be controlled with mental health interventions, and then healthy signals like pain or lethargy to tell us when to sleep, or hunger when to tell us to eat? So this is a slide from an interesting study done years ago, back when the assumption was that different cultures experience different emotions. And it turned out to be false. This study found that when exposed to certain prompting events, all humans experience emotions universally, but we describe them differently because of language differences and cultural differences. But the emotions themselves, fear, for example, is experienced in all cultures. We don't have different emotions in different cultures. I also share this because you can actually see visually the function of each emotion in each of these images. So these images represent a summation of where participants identified activating sensation, like my heart is racing, I feel hot, flush in the face, muscle tension, versus deactivation, like you feel when you're half asleep, right? That represented in those light and bright blues. So what I find interesting, we're going to try to come back to this, as we go through a couple of key emotions that relate to complex trauma in particular. In theory, any emotion could be involved in complex trauma, but there are some core emotions that come up almost every time that we're going to focus on today. But what I find fascinating about this is that you can see the function of an emotion in this image. So less aesthetically pleasing, because I created it and I possess zero graphic design abilities. This is my sort of emotional Bible, if you will, right? This is what I give every client, sometimes immediately upon meeting them, because it is the biological function of each emotion, right? This is the reason we are feeling joy, is because we are engaging in an activity that is good for us, and the action urge associated with it is to do it, pursue it, try to get back to it or continue it. So we're going to go through a few key emotions, but what I'm also going to do is highlight, here's joy, right? We use different language. Sometimes it's called happiness, but this whole person's body, brain, every organ, where we are completely activated in pursuit of whatever it is this person's doing or thinking about doing. Right. We move along to love, right? Signals some element of a relationship is good for our well-being, our needs, and it's urging us to pursue it and maintain it. Fear and anxiety, we covered before, is a threat. We want to avoid it. Anger tells us when we need to defend our needs, when there's an immediate present moment threat or blocking a particular need. Sadness telling us when an important need is missing or we're disconnected from it. And this is a little bit more controversial because this isn't, so far everything I've said comes right out of the DBT literature and lots of other pieces of literature. But the research on depression I find incredibly interesting, especially the research that focused on animal models, and found that when a bear hibernates, it's not seasonal depression. It's literally depression, and it's adaptive. If a bear didn't hibernate in the winter, it would continue to do what this emotion was telling it to do, forage for food, which results in eating, which results in dopamine that reinforces that behavior is good. But when there is no food, it's all frozen or gone. If the bear engaged in that behavior of foraging for food that works in spring and the summer, it would starve to death. And this is the beginning of the line of research that started to find that depression is not this illness, disease model. Medical thinking does not apply here. Depression is your brain trying to tell you something, not surprisingly, just like all the other emotions, right? It wouldn't make sense that depression is the only emotion that isn't telling us something when all the other ones are telling us something. It turns out this researcher, and I can't remember, it's been years, but he started on actually studying deer. He was drinking coffee in his kitchen and noticed that all his deer had an odd resemblance in different markers to his patients, and then started studying and found that behavioral and biomarkers support it. So when a bear is hibernating in the winter, it's actually responding to depression, telling it that what it's doing is a hopeless way of getting its needs met. Surviving is not going to work if you continue to forage for food and use more energy than you are replacing. So it puts the bear in timeout. It takes away the bear's energy and willingness, right? Anhedonia, ringing any bells? And it protects the bear from itself. It's the brain's bear saying, this is a hopeless way of getting your needs met. In human translation, right? If my partner leaves me and I can't tolerate the sadness that comes from that, which is going to tell me to either replace what's missing and try to get back with my partner or find a new partner. And let's say I feel threatened by that emotion and I avoid it, either through excessive exercise, substance use, dissociation, whatever you want to call it. Eventually I'm going to get depressed because my brain is going to beg me to stop whatever that behavior is. That's a hopeless way of replacing what's missing. So when I meet a patient and they tell me they're depressed, I say, oh, let's figure out what's not working. Sometimes it's something the patient is doing, like perfectionism. If I can only do things I know I can do perfectly, I'm not going to be able to do very much. That's a hopeless way of getting my needs met. So depression is often telling some of those patients that we got to drop that attachment. Sometimes it's not the patient's or the individual's fault or problem. right? When you think about poverty, systemic racism, the individual may be responding very appropriately or effectively to the signals in their mind, but the environment is unfairly blocking or suppressing an individual's right or ability to seek out a particular need. In that case, the depression or hopelessness is signaling at what is hopeless in terms of the environmental response. I just wrote a paper. It feels like I just wrote a paper, but since COVID, everything feels like it was yesterday. But it was probably 5 years ago that I just wrote this paper with a couple of colleagues on this idea of traumatic conditioning as it potentially explains impacts on minority stress as a trauma response. Guilt and shame come up a lot with our trauma clients. I don't really want to open Pandora's box here with the shame, but we do see guilt a lot. Guilt is our brain telling us that it's basically trying to get us reconnected with the pack, right? I did something wrong. I crossed my values, or I did something that made somebody else upset. I crossed their values. Guilt is trying to help me repair, get back with the pack. If using the term shame is problematic for you here, then I would encourage you to replace it with blame, self-blame, because in complex PTSD and what Martin Bohas found is that shame is the only emotion on this list that we're not born with. Right? Embarrassment, he conceptualizes it as basically a form of guilt. I know linguistically, I'm probably going to push people's buttons and people are going to disagree, but what he was really trying to make an argument for, which I've since become a believer in, is this idea that whatever state you're in when you are blaming yourself, beating yourself up, convincing yourself you're wrong, everything's your fault, there's really no primary emotion, biological function to that. It's more of a coping strategy for living through an unhealthy situation. And I'll explain what I mean when we talk about the concept of traumatic conditioning. So guilt is I did something wrong and I got to repair to get back with the group. And shame is this idea that I am wrong. There's something wrong with me or everything's my fault. Any questions about that, about the emotions piece? I'm kind of cruising through this, but this is a pretty big topic. Any of this feel problematic to you based on your background and training and thinking? Any of this feel like, okay, I've always known this is boring. I'm just curious where people are at. Feel free to just talk out loud. A little interaction doesn't hurt.
Just a totally different framing on the depression piece. Very interesting. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So depression can be constructive or can be appropriate?
I would argue it's almost always constructive or appropriate. There are some scenarios with like traumatic brain injury where there are these one-off causes or etiologies to depression that I don't think necessarily fit perfectly, but I would say most of the depression I see in my clinical practice has this constructive, helpful function to it once you can decipher what it's telling you. Right? Most of my clients, when they're feeling depressed and hopeless, they feel that their future is hopeless, or they are hopeless, or recovery is hopeless. But really, they're just misinterpreting what the emotion is trying to tell them. Something I'm doing or that my environment is doing is a hopeless way of getting my needs met. I've never met a client who's depressed where that doesn't fit. I've also never met a client where once they figure that out and then find a different way to get their needs met, they drop perfectionism, they stop drinking when they're sad, whatever it is. I've never met a client that stays depressed. So people often think of depression as like bad sadness or sadness that like stuck around too long or something. And a lot of the research on emotion really suggests or strongly states that this is an entirely different signal with its own function. I think our culture associates the two because our cultures are so sadness phobic that our phobia of sadness leads us to develop depression, but there's really no other connection between those. There's no greater connection between sadness and depression than that as compared to depression and other emotions. Any other thoughts or comments, questions? It's one of my favorite topics to discuss, because I feel like so many of the interventions that I was trained in didn't start with this basic assumption. And therefore, everything I did, despite my best intentions, especially when I'm wearing my, like, I look back at like my cognitive restructuring CBT days, and I'm like horrified that I successfully got a kid to pet a dog they were afraid of by gaslighting that kid's brain and convincing them not to trust the signals that were coming from it. And I feel like there's an emotionally consistent way that you can accomplish the same thing: get the kid to pet the dog, overcome their phobia, without teaching them to simultaneously not trust their brain. In other words, I was winning battles but losing a war, meaning that kid would come back 3 or 4 years later with a different anxiety disorder because I didn't teach that kid how to trust their brain. I just taught them to be more functional while suffering in silence, which is what Marshall Linehan calls stage 2 of DBT, quiet desperation. You're no longer disturbing other people with your suicidal and self-harming behavior, but you're just as miserable as you were before. All right. The other assumption, which is an implication of the first assumption, is that symptoms and the disorders we treat, OCD, social anxiety disorder, GAD, perfectionism, disordered eating, substance use, etc., are not actually disorders. They're coping strategies. And this will hopefully be crystal clear when we talk about how secondary emotions develop. Computer's a little slow here. So you recall back here, when if our mission with classic PTSD is to avoid the memory, I've got to also avoid direct reminders and indirect reminders. And in order to do that, I've got to deploy some coping strategies, some behaviors. Same here with Martin's trauma network, which captures complex trauma. And what I found fascinating about Melanie Harned's research, among other things, she's a pioneer. She showed us we don't have to be afraid to treat people with co-occurring suicidality and self-harm and trauma, that we're not going to kill them. She actually showed that not only are they less likely to suicide or self-harm because of treating the trauma, but you indirectly put other disorders and symptoms out of business. Depression improves, guilt improves, shame improves, overall functioning improves, which to me's got my wheels turned. I'm like, well, wait a second. If I treat BPD with DBT and I can get a client to be less suicidal and less self-harming, but I can't get them to be less miserable or less impacted by trauma, and we reverse that, we treat the trauma and all this other stuff improves, what does that kind of suggest about the other stuff? Is BPD a standalone diagnosis, or is BPD what you have to do to live with untreated trauma? And I would argue that Melanie's research proves that you put the trauma out of business and those symptoms start going out of business, which means that they weren't symptoms, they were coping strategies. So I find that her line of research just blew open my mind beyond just permission to treat these folks, and showed me that things that when I started were damning, right? Borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality, like these are just lifelong, you're going to live with this forever. And not only obviously has research shown that they're not permanent, but to think of them as coping strategies, I can't tell you how empowering it is to my clients when they start to connect the dots and see that this is a coping strategy. It's not happening to them. It's not who they are. It's something they learn to go to survive. I mean, I don't know if you guys, anybody here has ever experienced any of these sort of emotional difficulties, but PTSD untreated, living with active PTSD or complex PTSD would be impossible unless you deploy coping strategies. Take a look at the symptom checklist for borderline personality disorder and think of them as coping strategies. And I'd be surprised if it doesn't sort of do for me what it did for you guys, which is like, oh my God, that's what, this is so much more doable now. And I find our clients feel the same way. All right, extending off of assumptions 1 and 2. This is nodding back to that comment I said before, that the field of trauma is so ironically, there's this big gap that is so ironically invalidating to individuals with trauma because of that criterion A event. And I get, for the researchers here, we got to be got to operationalize things. We got to know what we're doing, what we're not doing. Otherwise, we can't conclude, can't make certain conclusions that we need to make in order for research to work. But I don't know why that line of thinking became the same line of thinking for how we diagnose people and understand people. I get it in a research lab. You gotta isolate variables. But this rigid criterion A event, I'm going to argue with some research, is indicative of us missing the broader problem. So not only did Melanie's research, Melanie Harned, in collaboration with Linehan and others, find that borderline personality disorder is basically a set of coping strategies for living with untreated trauma. When you treat the trauma, those coping strategies / what people call symptoms improve, because of course they improve, right? Security guard standing outside a bank doesn't show up on Monday if the bank closes. So these coping strategies that I've developed would of course extinguish or go away if the thing it's protecting is no longer there. So let's look at, I never know how to pronounce, I think it's Baris et al. And colleagues did a massive meta-analysis, reviewed 97 studies on people with borderline personality disorder, and found that they were 14 times more likely to report childhood trauma. Right, so 71% of people with borderline personality disorder experience trauma as defined by the DSM. That means 30% didn't. So my theory right now doesn't look so hot, that all BPD is untreated trauma coping strategies. But if you expand that research to include the ACEs study, and now we look at adverse childhood events, which is basically just saying, forget the criterion A, let's look at a list of things we know through research are correlated with poor mental health and medical health and other socioeconomic outcomes. 95% of patients with borderline personality disorder have met criteria for an ACEs event, which tells me, what are the chances that these 5% just have a unique form of borderline personality disorder that grew from nothing? Or perhaps even the ACEs studies are not encompassing enough. And I'm going to make an argument that this idea of traumatic conditioning, which is literally just conditioning two experiences together, would capture these 95% of these individuals, and plus these 5% who maybe didn't, parents didn't divorce, didn't grow up around violence, but just had an emotionally invalidating environment, which would have made it just as difficult for them to get their needs met because as kids were trapped and helpless. But we're going to go ahead and try to make the case that all of these individuals are experiencing traumatic conditioning, and that all of BPD is the result of living with untreated trauma. And I would then argue, if we can apply it there to some of the hardest to work with clients, we could probably make good progress with other folks who on paper tend to present in less acute, less complex ways. So we all remember this guy from our Psych 101 textbooks. Well, I would argue like the answer to transdiagnostic mechanisms has been under our nose in a book we probably haven't looked at since we were an undergrad for our entire careers. That we're making this more complicated than it needs to be. So we all remember, Pavlov and what he was able to do with the dog and pair the neutral stimulus with the conditioned stimulus, and before you know it, the bell is creating the conditioned response. The conditioned stimulus creates the conditioned response, right? So just a quick review of our Psych 101 textbooks. Doesn't seem super revolutionary when we're getting a dog to drool, right? But what I want to remind you that people always forget about with this study is that he also showed that you can get the dog to stop drooling by unconditioning the response, which is critical to where we're headed with this. So what if we applied Pavlov's principles not to steak and drooling or salivating, hunger? What if we applied it to any emotional experience, right? So here's a healthy emotional situation. Every baby, I've got a now eight-month-old. She's pretty happy, but she cries. When she cries, what's happening? She's sad. Her brain is telling her something is missing, right? That's all normal and healthy. This is why we had to go back over emotions or signals. If the need is blocked, and I experience sadness, and sadness does its job. It helps me recover the need, right? That's what it's supposed to do, right? I'm starting to hint at attachment for those of you who have an attachment background. It's reinforced. So the sadness signals the need is missing. It helps me and my caregivers, because I'm so little, get that need recovered. And then it's reinforced with safety, contentment, joy, love, some positive experience. It says, hey, this is great. It worked, right? Folks who grow up like this, every time sadness happens, do not develop emotion disorders. They, they're one in a trillion. I've never met them. I myself am not one of these people. I've never met a person who's got a perfectly healthy relationship to their emotions, especially not sadness. I taught my wife the difference between primary and secondary emotions. She said, "Is that why you're kind of like an irritable jerk?" She didn't use. She used even more colorful. Is that why you're kind of like an irritable jerk when you're feeling sad about something? And I'm like, "Yep," but we'll get into how that happens. So this is how it's supposed to go. And this is how it goes for most of us, right? Need is missing. Sadness is signaled. It's trying to help us become aware that there's something important missing, and it's trying to urge us or help us get that need replaced or met. If that emotion is not met with the need being recovered, it does not work. Instead, it is met with the need being blocked, and the environment is one in which where I am trapped and helpless. There's nothing I can do about it. It's not like I can say, okay, my mom didn't respond to me, my dad didn't respond to me, so I'm going to go to the mom and dad store and get a new mom and dad that will respond to me, right? This kid is trapped. All right. So if those two things occur, the need is missing, the emotion doesn't get the job done in a context where I'm trapped and out of control or helpless, we see the exact same thing that happens for Pavlov's dog, we see in ourselves, right? My brain goes, I never want to feel trapped and out of control and helpless. That is a human, it's a survival experience, right? You take the cutest little puppy golden retriever, you corner it, you trap it, eventually it'll bite you, right? It doesn't matter what the nature is. It is a survival experience to not be willing or able to tolerate helplessness. But when that helplessness gets paired with something healthy, because of how it was taught and learned, just like the bell and the dog, now we've got, well, the pairing is called traumatic conditioning. The outcome I'll get to in a moment, but I want to share this old school video. A lot of you have probably seen it, maybe in undergrad, but it's the still face experiment. And I want you to just take a second to watch it for a moment, but and then we'll come back to this particular concept and what I'm trying to make.
Was she sits down and
Can you
she's
guys hear it?
playing with her baby who's about
Okay.
a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
All right. Always relieving to see the baby go back to baseline at the end. So what did y'all notice as it relates to what we're talking about? Feel free to just shout out. And if you don't feel like talking, I can just not play the annoying teacher game.
I was just
What everybody
commenting that
noticed.
that video is so painful to watch every time. It's just cringing. But yes, clearly a lot of attempts to try to influence the environment and then just falling apart.
Yeah. In the beginning, he described it as like the mom and the baby are coordinating. I don't know that I would agree with any of the language he was using, but the concept he captured, I thought was perfect in this video. But in the beginning, when they were quote unquote coordinating, right, this is a baby who's connected to its caregiver. This is why attachment's so important when you're little, because you're helpless, right? A child is uniquely helpless. They cannot get their needs met without the assistance of others, right? And when the baby is on the same page with the mom, the baby's happy and content because they're quote unquote coordinated. If I need something, we're in sync. This person's going to help me get it. When she turns to the still face part of the experiment, the thing that jumps out to me is how unbelievably quickly this baby becomes aware how helpless they are. Right? This baby is losing its quote unquote posture, to use his language. It's getting dysregulated. It is panicking. The baby is aware, I am screwed without this person. And this person just disappeared. Right? And then you can tell that this kid's got a fairly healthy attachment because she recovered so quickly. But if you can imagine that happening to a person for more than 2 minutes, all day, every day, right? Eventually, that sadness that baby experienced, which worked, it brought mom back, right? It got reinforced. If it didn't get reinforced and the baby learned sadness equals helplessness, you've got yourself the recipe for trauma. And I would argue complex trauma. And I would argue that that's actually the mechanism of attachment when it goes well, and all the different forms of insecure attachment or anxious attachment when it doesn't go well. Because that attachment to me, as a behaviorist, I sometimes want to hit my head against the wall when I read literature on attachment, not because it's not a thing and it's not important, because it's crucial, but because the folks who write about it are so verbose. And so I feel like I'm reading philosophy that I'll never understand. So again, my reductionistic, maybe I'm just simple. I needed to understand attachment, so I tried to define it for myself behaviorally. Attachment is my confidence I'm going to get my needs met. If I'm attached to you, I'm confident you're going to help me get my needs met. If I'm attached to myself, then I'm confident I'm going to be able to get my needs met. So we can see this child's awareness of how helpless it is. And we can see the beginnings of a potential insecure attachment if that were to happen to this child, and its neurological signals in connection with, in this case, moms, we're not working or reinforced properly, right? Now, any questions about that? Okay. So again, just to review, traumatic conditioning is basically the pairing or the association of a healthy experience with an unhealthy experience, helplessness, right? This applies to classic PTSD, right? Somebody that we've got the memory associated with the state of helplessness. It applies to physical. If you've ever worked with, sexual assault survivors, the healthy experience of sexual arousal is no longer experienced as healthy. It's experienced as threatening because it's a reminder of feeling helpless and out of control. Right? You can insert almost any primary. You can insert any primary experience here that has the potential to get paired or associated with helplessness. Right? If I am in a car accident, and the music that was playing in that car accident plays again, right? My mind may have an association between that helplessness and that song, and I might have a flashback, or I might just feel completely out of control all over again because of that association. So, like I said, this dot has this circle here that represents helplessness has been red from the beginning because it is not a healthy, adaptable, habituatable experience. This is something we are all ingrained, trained to avoid, prevent, escape. So once we have this sort of learned association, our brain needs to combat the helplessness and by proxy, the sadness, right? Because now I've got to avoid both, because in my mind, it's the same thing. And I don't know if others have heard, but trauma is an adaptive response to a maladaptive situation, right? So this is a maladaptive situation, but we're going to need to adapt now. to reduce our experience of helplessness and loss of control. So, like I said before, there's a classic PTSD way of conceptualizing this. There's Martin's. We've learned from Melanie. There's this association of coping strategy. So we've got this association here, right? We've been traumatically conditioned. We now are. We've got our mission is to avoid obviously helplessness, which it always was, but because of the learned association, like Pavlov's dog, it's now to also avoid sadness. Okay. Sadness is at the center of every trauma network, but every client you work with is not going to have the same primary experiences that are at the center of their network. But the reason sadness is always there is because when you lose control over something, by definition, it's a loss. That sadness's job is to signal a loss, which is why sadness is at the center of every trauma network I've ever treated. So to combat this, to survive, right? Trauma is a resilient response. Our brain is smart. It's plastic. It deploys its resources and develops secondary emotions. So Marsha Linehan defined this a long time ago, and she did it well. Primary emotions are those that are signals that give us information about our needs. Secondary emotions are emotions we learn or we experience in response to a primary emotion. So when I taught my wife this is when she figured out that when I get angry and irritable and I'm kind of a jerk, it's because I'm feeling sad about something that I feel is a threat. The sadness itself is a threat, because I was never introduced to sadness as a healthy emotion. I grew up Irish Catholic on Long Island. We had humor and sarcasm and anger. that was it. Sarcasm is obviously not an emotion, but in my little world, it kind of was. Right, that was it. There was no sadness, like, oh, I'm missing something. I'm gonna grieve the loss. I would have been laughed out of my house. Right. So I taught this to my wife. She goes, oh, so that's why you're a jerk when you're sad. Because I am trying to defend against something I feel or have learned as a threat. Now, anger has it can be a primary emotion, but in this example, it's a secondary emotion because I'm feeling it in response to the primary emotion. If you get in my face and threaten me, that's healthy primary anger telling me to protect myself and defend myself. That's not secondary anger. That would be primary anger because it's giving me information about my needs. So when we are survivors of trauma, we are survivors of helplessness. And to make sure we never see that movie again, we deploy these secondary emotions and the behaviors that come with them to try to make sure that we never see that movie or experience that again. I would argue, and this, I also want to be clear, this is the most common set of secondary emotions I see, and this is the most common primary. But actual trauma networks have a lot more primary than just this, and they've got a lot more diversity in the secondary. But I teach it in this way because this is the most common. I see a patient who struggles with anxiety. Think about an intake with a really tough client, right? They try to avoid talking about certain things. Maybe they dissociate, they shut down, you push, they snap, they get angry with you. If that doesn't work, then they beat themselves up and they blame themselves, right? I mentioned this before. This is a trauma resilient response, because if avoidance didn't work to help me not feel helpless and out of control, and anger and fighting and defending didn't work, this is a really crafty way to make myself feel like I'm in control again, right? And the way I like to introduce this is sort of semi-experientially. So imagine I am a child storybook author, and I write a bedtime story called Bad Shit's Coming. Okay. And at night, my 8-month-old daughter, we're getting her ready for bed, and I read the story. Bad stuff happened today. More bad stuff's happening tomorrow, and there's nothing you can do about it. Right? She's not sleeping. I'm not selling any copies of this book. This is a horror show. Right? Obviously, I wouldn't make that book, but that's the book trauma survivors are reading or experiencing metaphorically every day, especially when they go to sleep at night. And this is a really crafty way to regulate and ground myself and combat the idea that I'm out of control. If everything bad that happened to me today is my fault, and I can convince myself of it, right? They're not core beliefs, they're not symptoms, right? My worthlessness, my self-judgment, my insert blank here. These are coping strategies. I'm like a method actor trying to convince myself that all the bad things that have gone on in my life are my fault, because terrible for your self-esteem, by the way. but fantastic for your sense of control, because if everything that happened today is my fault, then everything that might happen tomorrow is back in my control. So it's a really crafty way to restore a sense of control for folks who've been made to feel incredibly out of control in quite visceral, traumatic ways. Any questions about this so far? Any comments? Okay. So think about a client you're working with. Again, I don't know how this applies to you guys, because this may or may not help or apply to folks with thought disorders. But think about a client who's got symptoms. Maybe include the thought disordered symptoms, or maybe think of a client who's got symptoms of a thought disorder and other areas of difficulty, or maybe just think of a client without a thought disorder. I don't know how this thought experiment will work for this particular crew, but what I would encourage you to do is think about the disorders or symptoms that brought them to treatment. Okay. When I meet with a client, this is my starting point. I am mapping out what I'm hearing they're struggling with. Whoops. And creating what I call a trauma network. Right. This is the way I come to understand a person. Somebody struggling with suicidal ideation or self-harm, they're either trying to avoid through a preventative way. I'm trying to prevent future sadness and loss of control, or I'm trying to escape, like dissociation. I'm trying to escape from experiencing that sadness and loss of control. Right. These are just examples I kind of jotted down and came up with. But one of the things that I've seen that troubles me the most about eating disorders and OCD is they're almost always seen as like their own disorder. It's their own distinct thing that's happening almost in a vacuum, and we got to send people to treatment that's specific for that thing. And sometimes that helps people get better, which is great when it does. But I find that most of these clients get better most of the time, if not all the time, when we conceptualize them as what I would argue for what they are, which is coping strategies. OCD is not, to me, a standalone anxiety disorder. It's a thing my mind goes to restore a sense of control. Same with eating disorders. I mean, eating disorder is like the most Swiss Army knife of trauma coping strategies I could think of. You can obsess over food and body image and eating and not eating and the sensation of hunger. I mean, it's literally, unless you're asleep, you can be engaging with an eating disorder as a sense of avoiding feeling out of control, because you're sort of focused on that as a way of either avoiding, escaping, preventing a loss of control. Can you guys think of a symptom, for example? And again, the caveat being in thought disorders, my Beck training convinced me that maybe there is more, that maybe there is a possibility of mapping out certain thought disorder symptoms on this network. I think it's a really exciting research question, but I don't know if it's going to highlight what I'm trying to highlight here. So think about a non-psychosis example and where it would map out. And can you think of an example, or is there a symptom or behavior that you're struggling to figure out where it would go? Because this is definitely not a comprehensive list. It's just a couple of examples that I see a lot. While you're thinking about that, and feel free to interrupt me if you think about something. I'm going to apply what we talked about before to that concept of depression, right? So depression has a place in this whole process. And when I meet a person with trauma or complex trauma and depression, this is going to sound a little dark, but I'm relieved. And I'll explain why in a second. So let's just take this one coping strategy that might help me prevent, avoid, or escape some future loss or loss of control, right? If I am trying to I'm only willing to do things perfectly, or I won't do them at all. How many of my values can I connect with, or my needs can I get? Probably not many. So I would argue that the thing that helps you survive trauma, right? Remember that phrase before that I always see in trauma literature: the solution becomes the problem, where trauma is an adaptive response to a maladaptive situation, right? This is an adaptive response if I'm in the trapped, helpless environment, right? A soldier in a war zone develops hypervigilance, maybe aggression, some paranoia, right? Those aren't symptoms of PTSD in a war zone. They're survival skills, right? So perfectionism, it might be a way I try to restore a sense of control when something's maybe out of control. But if I get out of that traumatic environment and I continue to be hypervigilant like the soldier, and I'm diving for my sidearm every time I hear a bat hit a ball at a Little League game, that's a problem. Now it's a disorder. Now it's PTSD. So we said before, if I can't get my needs met, if I have to do everything perfectly, then perfectionism, which started off as a coping strategy, becomes a problem. And depression is going to help me figure that out. Depression is my brain saying, okay, these secondary emotions and the behaviors that came with them, that got you through it, they saved you, right? They were the solution. They were the hero at the time when you were trapped and helpless. They are no longer they are now a hopeless way of getting your needs met. Think about a core need you have and how you would go about connecting with it if your only tools are avoid, fight, and blame yourself, right? Can't connect with your partner. You can't really pursue any kind of exciting professional dreams. You're just avoiding, fighting, and blaming. At a certain point, your brain is going to recognize, in this small example, my brain is recognizing that perfectionism, which got me through my trauma, is now a hopeless way of getting my needs met. So that's why when I see a client with trauma and depression, I'm like, oh, good, your brain has already figured out that this isn't working anymore. You might be ready to treat this trauma and put these secondary emotions down. To further highlight this real quick, one of my favorite moments in sharing this concept of a trauma network with a patient happened in person back before the pandemic. This young man was referred to me. He was in a program that specialized in suicide and self-harm, a DBT program. And he was in a program, and that program noticed that he was experiencing symptoms of OCD, and they sent him to another program to work with another coach to do OCD exposures. Right? Makes sense. Sounds like good care. But it didn't work. When this kid's OCD improved, his suicide and self-harm got worse. When this kid's suicide and self-harm improved, his OCD got worse. It was like whack-a-mole. So he got referred to me. I mapped out this kid's experience on the coffee table in my office, a little piece of paper. He took it from me and he said, Ryan, this looks like a tree. He turns a piece of paper vertically like you see it on your screen. He said, this looks like a tree. And I'm looking at it like, not really, but okay, go on. And he said, I think I realized why I'm not getting better. Using the analogy of a tree, my treatment has been trying to kill the tree by cutting the leaves. We need to cut the root of the tree. And I thought to myself, holy cow, this guy gets it. He really just figured it out. Because by going to the OCD treatment, he was trimming that tree, but then this self-harm would get worse, and then he'd go trim that tree, that leaf, and then the OCD would get worse. He said, we need to cut the root of the tree. We need to disassociate helplessness with this other emotion. Does this make sense to everybody? I'm just still getting over the cough part of COVID. So any questions about this while I recover for a second? Any comments?
We talk about in substance use in some areas, we talk about it as like trimming leaves off of like I talk about it as like trimming the grass, right? I can mow your yard, but the grass will come back. Like we can take substances out of the equation. But if we don't deal with like the beliefs that lie underneath that, the roots of the problem, like this grass will grow back every time. So like we can't just take that part out of the problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
we can't
exactly.
just remove that and expect the problem to end. And it's funny because trauma is such a big like integral root in that system. I talk about if I've said it once, I've said it a million times, like substance use is a symptom of something much larger. And so when you just take away a symptom, like you aren't fixing the issue. So no, it's really interesting to hear other people talk about it this way because you don't hear it talked about very commonly.
I appreciate you sharing that, Devin. And my hope is that by the end of today, the conversation can maybe even go one step further. Instead of substance abuse as a symptom of a problem, substance abuse is a coping strategy, which may be what you meant anyway. Which is why when you mow the lawn, it just grows back, right? Just like
Exactly.
this kid, it just grew back. It was grown back in different topographies, but it grows back nonetheless. So if we're on the same page with this concept, and we can now sort of see how this could help us explain not only complex trauma, but really any emotion disorder, in my opinion. We then want us to think about what Pavlov thought about, which is the part of his experiment, which is the part of his experiment that nobody talks about, which is the part where he unpaired the stimuli, right? And it's simple but not easy, right? The concept is simple. What we need to do is simple, but the journey to get there is like climbing Mount Everest, right? We need to unpair this healthy primary emotion with this unhealthy learned association to helplessness, so that I can experience sadness without feeling viscerally out of control and having to turn to these coping strategies to restore a sense of safety or balance. That make sense? Put differently, we want to create new learning through exposure, right? Michelle Krask's work on the inhibitory learning model certainly applies here. But our goal is a little bit more specific. We're creating new learning through exposure so that we may unpair primary experiences from their traumatic associations or helplessness and help a person in the short run act opposite to secondary emotions and action urges, and in the long run extinguish these emotions and their function to begin with. Make sense? Okay. Put differently, if this goes, there's an added layer of complexity here that I want to focus on that kind of maybe applies a little bit, Devin, to your client's example around the substance use example you shared with us. So for many individuals who've experienced some, or I'll say moderate to moderately severe amounts of traumatic conditioning, the exposure process, the treatment of restoring a person's ability to get in touch with that primary emotion, act opposite, and ultimately extinguish the secondary emotion sort of follows this sequence, right? First thing I do is I can identify what I'm feeling. I can understand what those emotions mean. I can either validate what they're telling me about my needs if they're primary, or I can figure out how to identify a primary versus secondary emotion. Am I feeling sad while I think about a need that's missing, primary? Or am I experiencing an emotion because of another emotion? Am I irritable because my wife brought up a topic that's making me feel sad? Okay, that's step 2. Then step 3 is determine whether you're still out of control. Now, this is an important step. I would have skipped this step if Martin hadn't taught me the lesson he learned when one of his earlier patients. But if this person is still out of control over those core needs, then we need to think less about treating PTSD and more about addressing safety. But assuming that person's grown up or they're no longer in the situation where they were traumatized or helpless and out of control, then we want to help them act on the primary emotion, find values, consistent ways to go get those needs met and problem solve, or act opposite to the secondary emotion. Now, this is only going to work for a client with mild to moderately severe complex trauma, or really any moderately severe emotion disorder. Now, let me take a step back and talk about the client that it's not going to work for, at least not without this extra step of addressing agency. So in Martin's training, I encourage anybody to go to either Melanie or Martin's training. They're both incredible. But when I went to Martin's training, he shared an example of a client he started working with complex trauma. And he targeted her shame with exposure therapy, just like a good exposure therapist would. And it worked. He successfully taught her, or she learned through exposure, that everything wasn't her fault. And surprising to him, and to me at the time when he was sharing, that patient immediately made a severe suicide attempt. Right? Kind of counterintuitive. Why would that person try to kill themselves if they're making progress? Well, what he was not recognizing at the time, and what he was teaching us in this example, is that this was not a symptom or a disorder. This is a coping strategy. And this is a person with severe, acute, complex trauma. And I just took away her Swiss Army knife. And I left her feeling helpless and out of control. So what this unearthed is for folks who can tolerate some of that primary emotion, right? And the way I assess this is I just ask people to talk to me a little bit about some of the stuff that's making them sad. And if they can more or less tolerate that discussion, they might not necessarily be crying. That might be part of the focus of the treatment, is to increase engagement with the sadness, but they're not, engaging in clearly I'm out of control, I'm flailing to survive and regulate. Then I just move ahead with that treatment and start talking about what are some of the things from your past and present that are making you feel sad, and let's act opposite to these, or let's do some exposure on these. But what Martin found is that doing exposure before we've addressed the agency issue left this person feeling incredibly out of control and unsafe. And therefore, we have to address agency. We have to address the helplessness with improving agency. Now, he doesn't call it agency. He calls it discrimination training. We have to help the person discriminate between the past and the present, the safe and unsafe people. It's sort of like an experiential check the facts. Although I like to think of it more as like an experiential agency exposure, right? The more out of control a patient is feeling in my care, the more I want to help them engage in an activity, which is what we call an agency activity. And I should slow down or back up. Agency is one's ability to get their needs met, to impact their environment and get a need met. Okay. When we're traumatized, we've lost agency at some point in our life. And an agency activity is a reminder of the agency you have today that you didn't have when this trauma network was imprinted. Right. So what is something my client can do today they couldn't do when they were at this very vulnerable, helpless, out of control state in their life? And there's two types of agency I think about. There's general agency, which is any activity that reminds you that you are more in the driver's seat in your life than you were when this happened, right? So anything you can do as an adult, basically, that you couldn't do as a child. And those are helpful, but not as potent. They're easier to come up with, but they don't have the same impact on the helplessness as what I would call contextual agency, which is an activity specifically related to the traumatic memory, something that you could not do then, that you probably wish you could have. It would have helped you, but you could do it now. So agency activities are things that we insert. They're almost like a form of distress tolerance. It's distress tolerance with the explicit goal of demonstrating through the activity itself that you can act opposite to helplessness, that you can demonstrate to yourself through action the agency you have today that you didn't have then, to combat the severity of that helplessness, so that you're not left feeling as out of control as this patient was left feeling. So basically what he suggested to do is, you're still going to go after these secondary emotions. You're just going to address the agency first, right? First thing we're going to do is remind you of the agency you had today that you didn't have then. And the more specific it is to what left the person being out of control in the past, the more potent and effective. And then you're going to move ahead with trying to expose the client to primary emotions to create an unpairing of these two experiences. Any thoughts or questions about that? I'm looking at the time. I'd love to leave a few minutes. I do have more slides to go into. It's basically just an overview of the structure of DBT PTSD and this new treatment I've been developing called dialectical emotion therapy, which is the application of the DBT PTSD principles to all emotion disorders. but I'd rather leave time for some questions if y'all have them. Do we have any questions?
Can you give some more examples of ways of increasing the sense of agency?
Yeah. Michelle, you've heard this many times, but my favorite example. So backing up, that question is the most common question I get from my team. And one of the reasons it's so clunky to answer is because it has to come from the client. It's got to be based on the ways in which they lost control. But I can give you some examples of things, for example. So one young man I worked with grew up with a mom with severe, I would say severe complex trauma, but in his language, she had severe BPD and depression. Much of his childhood, she was bedridden, and he was pretty trapped and out of control and had a pretty unhappy experience as a result. Fast forward to present day, the time I was working with him, he'd come to session regularly, beating himself up because he was lashing out at his girlfriend every time his girlfriend was talking about going on a vacation that he could not afford to go on with her. The reason he's lashing out at her is because she starts talking about the vacation, he feels sad. Back to a version of this that's got sadness there, right? He starts feeling sad. That's the very emotion that he was feeling as a kid when mom was bedridden and he was trapped. He couldn't do anything to make his own dinner. He was literally out of control over so many core needs. It was hard to understand, hard to imagine. So now this young man who's talking to his girlfriend about a pretty innocuous, positive, seemingly exciting topic is being a jerk, lashing out, yelling at her, basically engaging in secondary anger to make the topic of the vacation go away so he doesn't have to feel sad and out of control anymore. And it always works because then they get in a fight about what a jerk he's being, which wasn't exactly his goal, but it did work to help him escape from the sadness and loss of control. So I said, all right, bud, we have got to help you engage in some agency activities because all the skills we talked about in previous sessions to act opposite to anger, to try to notice the sadness, to try to feel the sadness, to try to express the sadness. It would all hit him so hard and so fast, he couldn't slow down enough to remember any of these skills, and the whole network was just happening in his experience faster than he could think to cope. So we engaged in agency activities in this example because it was a vacation. And while he didn't have the money for this vacation, he had the agency to save the money to go on a future vacation. So I told him, as a simple reminder of the agency you have today that you didn't have as a kid, I'd like you to transfer 25 cents from your checking account to your savings account every time you notice feeling angry at her about this vacation. And he came back to session a couple of weeks later and he had amassed like $75 in savings, which obviously is not going to be a great vacation, but that wasn't the point. We were not setting out to save for a vacation. We were setting out to identify when he was, in his network, and then act opposite in an agency reinforcing way by doing something that reminds him, I'm not actually trapped. This is reminding me of being trapped because it's the same sadness I felt as a kid, but I'm not trapped. If I want to go on a vacation, I possess the agency to save for it. And in time, it weakened the intensity of the helplessness that would co-occur with the sadness and allowed him to slow things down, act opposite to anger, and eventually express and feel the sadness, not only in that moment about the vacation, but also start to process some of the sadness about what it was like to grow up the way he did. That's just one example I like because it was something he came up with. So when coming up with agency activities, I think the client has to be educated on what it means and why we're doing it. And then they've got to think, if they can, about some of the components of the past associations that rendered them actually helpless. And then derive their own sort of opposite action or you literally just create the negative image of whatever that helplessness was. For this kid, it was the ability to get out of his house and save money and go take charge of his own life. He didn't need to get mom to feel less depressed, to get out of bed, to make dinner, or go to the grocery store.
Can you describe how this model might work for a thought disorder like schizophrenia, which is often said to have some association with trauma in the past?
Yeah, I've got some. I'm going to call them really baby, really preliminary hypotheses, because it's not my bread and butter area. What trauma is, but thought disorders. Thanks to Michelle Friedman and Michelle West on this call. These two, usually when I speak to this, you guys aren't on the call, but the two of you have helped me in my clinic feel much more comfortable with these thought disorders, and as a result, we're able to sort of help these kids in-house a lot more confidently. But I wouldn't say it's my area of expertise like it is you guys. But that said, I had a client who presented with what looked like a pretty clear, it was almost like a manic psychotic symptom. It was sort of delusions of grandeur and a little bit of paranoia, totally disconnected from reality. They believed that a celebrity was in a car and wanted them to sort of kind of jump in and join the crew. And that understandably created some problems for them in the way the public reacted, and it was labeled as a psychotic break or episode, or a moment of break from reality, which it was. I'm not denying that. But in going over that experience with that individual, not just right after it happened, but kind of processing it as another traumatic event years later, we came to, there was this connection where this client had this sort of way of dissociating as a kid when she went through trauma, where she had these fantasies. She'd listen to music and imagine she was the artist. She would escape, right? Coping strategies. And life went on for her, and she then had this horrific, unbelievable, heartbreaking, gaslit breakup in college that sparked this episode, this thought disordered episode. Now, 9 out of 10 judges are going to label that a psychotic break or a manic episode. Person had never demonstrated evidence of psychosis or mania before, and in the 10 years that followed, even after coming off of medicine. I would argue, at least in that example, that this was a form of dissociation. How she got there exactly, I don't know, but there was a clear connection between the way she used to escape mentally and the manifestation of that reality break, and the timing of it as perfect, basically, in that she felt she needed to escape from this visceral loss and sadness that reminded her of her own past trauma. And whether I'm correct or not, that it was really dissociation that really just looked like thought disorder, it helped her process it and grieve it from a place of empowerment in a way that didn't make her fear her brain moving forward. And she's now thriving with no meds at all. So that's like one example, but it's the cognitive, it's that Beck training where I was like, these guys are just validating people who are experiencing thought salads, and they're getting more linear. This can't be as biologically driven as I was previously thinking. Clearly, there's some biological vulnerability for anybody who develops a thought disorder or a bipolar process, but the ratio of how much I was trained or thinking it was medical, biological versus environmental almost flipped on an 80-20 dime after that training, after I saw what validation did for these folks. So that's one example. I've come across some others that I can't quite think of off the top of my head, but if you start with the question of like, is there a kernel of truth or wisdom to this otherwise kind of, use a colloquial term, kind of crazy thinking or thought disordered thinking, right? Is there something about this that it's got a kernel of wisdom if I think about the function of it, not the content? You can get lost in the content, but the function of it. Like for this young woman, it was the function of the escape which was how she used to dissociate. And it was almost like she was dissociating during this episode, but it on paper, it looked like what it looked like to all of us. I mean, that's what we would diagnose it with. But for her, it was dissociation, and seeing it that way and remembering it that way and processing it that way was so empowering and healing. She's never had a reoccurrence, and she's had some tough stuff since. But that's just one really clear is relative, but it's clear relative to what we're talking about example. Does that helpful at all, Ken?
Yes, that's great. That's great. This was mind-bending. It's wonderful. And I'm sorry, I have to go lead a meeting, but thanks so much for talking to us.
Absolutely. I do too. I'm chronically late to everything. So thank you for reminding me of the time.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. And thank you, Dr. Madigan. Very helpful. I'll just echo what folks are saying in the chat too. So really glad to have you with us, and thanks everyone for staying a couple minutes extra. Yeah, have a great rest of your Friday.
Thanks, guys.